It is my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Spring Berman. Spring is an associate professor of mathematical and aerospace engineering and a graduate faculty in computer science and exploration system design at Arizona State University. She directs the Autonomous Collective Systems Laboratory and is an associate director of the Center for Human Artificial Intelligence and Robot Teaming within the ASU Global Security Initiative. She has a PhD and an MSc degree in mechanical engineering and applied mechanics from the University of Pennsylvania, the BSc degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Princeton University, postdoctoral research in computer science at Harvard University. In the group that I particularly am very fond of, actually. So that's a very awesome kind of mark on your CV there, in my opinion. And Dr. Berman's research focuses on synthesis of control strategies, including bio-inspired controllers for robotics swarms and other types of distributed systems, such as soft robot manipulators. Her current research also uses virtual and small-scale physical testbeds to develop autonomous vehicle controllers that mimic human-like driving behaviors. She was a recipient of the ONR Young Investigator Award and the DARPA Young Faculty Award. So without further ado, Professor Spring Berman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, so today I'm going to be talking about some research that my group and I have done over the past while. We look at how can we control a type of system which is called a robotic swarm. And so robotic swarms are inspired often by natural collectives or swarms in nature. For example, this flock, or what's called a murmuration of starlings. And so these are collectives which can be very large, hundreds or thousands of individuals, that are capable of very complex collective behaviors, although there is no leader agent telling all the other agents what to do. Mostly the individual behaviors of the agents rely on local information that they get through local sensing or physical contact, and they may or may not have explicit communication. So each agent has a lot of autonomy in its decision-making based on this local information. So at the collective level, we see all sorts of interesting behaviors. And these behaviors are robust to the size of the swarm. So you can have some robots fail or make mistakes, or new robots or other individuals enter the system, and the collective behavior still functions. We also see that in nature, swarms have multifunctionality. So they're capable of lots of different behaviors, collective behaviors, like this honeybee colony, which can collectively decide on a new nest. They can also build the nest. So they're versatile in that sense. And they can adapt to changing conditions and objectives. So natural swarms are a source of inspiration for swarm robotics. Just to illustrate, here's an example at Arizona State University. We have what's called the drone studio, about 10,000 square feet, and it's instrumented with over 100 motion capture cameras. So we can do types of swarm tests with unmanned aerial vehicles like shown here, although we're not at the level of complexity as the same as the starling murmuration. Not yet. So in implementation, swarm control architectures can take different forms. So you could have some centralized element which computes the control command and perhaps broadcasts a set of common parameters to the swarm or a subset of the swarm. It becomes too computationally complex to individually assign controllers to robots if you have hundreds or thousands. So a broadcast paradigm seems more reasonable. You can also have distributed architectures where some robots can communicate locally with each other. And can locally compute commands for neighboring robots. You can have a completely decentralized architecture where each robot is just computing its controller on board and making its own decisions that way. You can also have different architectures for communication and sensing. So robots might be able to communicate locally with one another, and often we can model that communication network as a graph with robots as nodes, or they can operate without communication. You can also have sensing, so perhaps robots share their local sensor information with each other via communication. Maybe they only locally sense around themselves and don't communicate that. You may also take advantage of having an overhead view of the system, maybe through an overhead camera or motion capture cameras tracking the pose of every individual agent. So when that's available, that can be very useful in your controller. Okay, so given the definition and inspiration for our system, so why do we want to develop robotic swarms? So there are many applications which are motivated by the need to do some kind of task over very large areas, spatial areas, over long periods of time. And so some of these shown here, we can think about in terms of categories like sustaining the natural environment through environmental monitoring, cleanup, restoration, maintaining the human-built environment, such as infrastructure monitoring and repair. There's also a lot of applications in precision agriculture and mining. There have been companies developed to approach these problems using collective robotics. Logistics and transportation, manufacturing, construction, warehousing, like the Amazon Robotics warehouse, of course. So all of these, again, a swarm would be capable of doing these types of tasks over long periods of time, over large spatial areas. And then we can also think about emergency type applications or defense operations. There's also personal services or entertainment with drone light shows. And we can even think about applications at the micro and nano scale with micro and nano robots for biomedical applications. Okay, so over the past couple of decades, researchers in multi-robot systems have devised various approaches to controlling swarms for specific types of behaviors. And so I've listed some here. So you can imagine that you could mix and match these different behaviors to apply to the applications shown in the previous slides. So there's been a lot of work in devising strategies for specific behaviors. And looking forward, it would be useful to develop control strategies that allow the swarms to switch behaviors as needed, much like a social insect colony. So I'm going to talk about some of these in a minute that we have worked on. And our work is largely motivated by some outstanding challenges in the deployment of swarm robotics, or robotic swarms. So the technology, of course, has advanced to develop a whole range of robot platforms that could be deployed in swarms, whether they're underwater vehicles or ground robots or aerial robots. But a lot of the applications that I mentioned in the previous slides would take place in denied, inaccessible environments. So environments where it's dangerous or impossible for people to go. And oftentimes they will lack GPS, so they won't have global localization. They may have limited communication that drops out frequently. They might not have prior data about the environment. And so in a lot of these instances, we need to develop control strategies that can accommodate these constraints. And of course, we want the system to perform its behaviors over long terms and be robust to robot failures and errors. And one major thing that we want is we want to be able to predict with some confidence that despite all of these constraints, the swarm is going to behave as we predict it, or as we would like it to. So we want some way of predicting how the collective behavior will evolve, despite the fact that there is going to be uncertainty in the environment, and some uncertainty in the behaviors of the robots themselves. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some categories of swarm behaviors that we've worked on. And I'm going to start out with some behaviors for basically movement and multitasking. And we're going to look at this from the framework of swarm density control. So a common theme throughout our strategies here is the use of dynamical models of the system to help us develop our control strategies. And that's going to allow us to make these theoretical predictions of how the swarm will evolve under a particular controller. And so this framework, swarm density control, is very useful for that because it allows us to model what is effectively a very, very high-dimensional system with an arbitrary number of agents in different states, physical states or roles or tasks. This allows us to abstract it to a much lower dimensional system in terms of populations of robots in different states or tasks. And so this is very similar to modeling chemical reaction networks. Here, this is an example of a well-mixed swarm, quote unquote, where the robots are randomly searching for little pieces on the ground to pick them up and put them together according to an assembly plan. And so we can model the swarm as the set of individuals that are searching, and they have their own physics and dynamics. But this is not so useful for rigorously designing controllers. So what we can do is abstract the system to a set of populations, so robots that are searching or robots that are holding a certain type of part. And we can model this as what's called a mean field model or macroscopic model that consists of differential equations that describe the evolution of the density of robots in different states over time. And what's nice about these types of models is you can prove things about their time evolution, and they are also independent of the swarm size because they are modeling the swarm as a continuum rather than a set of discrete agents. So now, of course, not all swarms are well mixed. So sometimes we might have to model the spatial evolution as well of the swarm. And to do that, we would need to model the density field as a function of space as well as time. And in that case, it's governed by partial differential equations rather than ordinary differential equations. Okay, so now we have this multi-level modeling scheme. And so we can call the model of individual agents the microscopic model. And the macroscopic model is the differential equation in this case. Okay, so here's an example where we're just modeling robots that are switching stochastically between two states, A and B. And we have this probability rate of switching tasks that we call K. So in this case, the macroscopic model is going to be these two differential equations that describe the population of robots in state A or B over time. And they're just functions of that parameter K. So now we can use different techniques from control and optimization to design K for some objective. So in general, we might want the populations to converge to some equilibrium ratio over time. For example, so the macroscopic model here is used as a design tool for controllers, where the control inputs, in this case K, map to the individual robot control policies. So if we look at an example where we're also modeling spatial dynamics, so here's a general formulation of the robot's motion. In this case, the robots are moving according to some velocity field V and a diffusion coefficient D. So we have this Brownian-like motion, which represents randomness in the robot's movement due to, it could be just errors in sensing and actuation, or it could actually be intentionally randomly walking just to increase its dispersion and improve searching performance, for example. And so we can treat V and D also as control inputs. So we can design them using the partial differential equation, or PD model, at the macroscopic level. Again, we can apply control and optimization techniques to design V and D and K, in addition, for certain objectives in terms of the evolution of the swarm population dynamics. Okay, so specifically, we've looked at problems of controllability and stabilization. And so how can we compute the control inputs that I just discussed for these objectives? So controllability here, this is defined in terms of an ordinary differential equation. So we have a dynamical system, x dot equals f of x u, where u is the control input. And so we say that the system is controllable if given an initial state. For every target state, xt, there exists some control input such that the state goes from the initial state to the target state at some given time. Okay, so we can drive the system from one state to another in finite time. Stabilizability is an asymptotic property, which says that the system is going to be stabilizable to a given target state xt if there is some map k such that the closed loop system below that x dot equals f of xk makes that point xt asymptotically stable. And so we can consider a couple of different types of control inputs. So the state feedback control laws U only requires the agents to know their current state. So if they know their current state, they can apply that particular control input. We can also design a more complicated control law, which relies on local measurements of the swarm population density. And so we refer to these as mean field or density or ensemble feedback control laws. So now the agents need more information, but it does give us some nice properties, which I'll talk about. Okay, so we've looked at various types of systems that describe swarm dynamics. We've looked at the problems of achieving controllability and stabilization to target distributions of in the robots, in the swarm's state space, essentially. So we've looked at discrete state spaces and continuous state spaces, and also hybrid state spaces where the robots, they're moving in space and then they can switch between different tasks. And we've also looked at some optimal transport problems as well, where the robots have specific types of dynamics. Okay, so if we start with this discrete state space, we can think of this as a coverage problem or a task allocation problem. In the video here, we have a swarm of robots redistributing among a set of states, which are these just these squares. But the squares could also represent a set of abstract tasks. So this is an overhead view of the robots being tracked by an overhead camera, and we specify the target distribution. And so what we can do is assign the robots, maybe through broadcast, a set of common parameters, the control inputs, that determine the rate of switching from one state to another, or one square to another. And so the way that these are designed, these control laws use feedback on the local density. In this particular case, it's the number of robots in adjacent squares. And the inclusion of this density in the control law allows the robots to, once they reach equilibrium, they stop switching. So if you don't have that feedback, they'll just keep switching between states and wasting energy. So we can also devise a control law which is only a function of the density at their current state. And so that allows us to actually control the swarm to redistribute to any target distribution, including ones with no robots assigned at equilibrium at certain states. So it doesn't have to be positive everywhere. All right, so we've assumed that the robots in that scenario know where they are, right? And they know what state they're in. They have the state feedback control law that they can use to decide probabilistically whether to go to one adjacent square or another. But maybe they don't have that information about where they are. Maybe we still want to redistribute them. So we can come up with a different sort of framework where if we have another sophisticated agent, which we call a leader, that does have global localization, what we can do is use a herding approach, sort of like a sheep herding dog, where this leader agent is moving over this discrete domain, and the swarm agents can sense it, and if it's in their current state, then they kind of flee probabilistically to adjacent squares. But they do that with a uniform probability. So it turns out that you can design the leader trajectory to repel the swarm, basically, into a target distribution. And so to show that, on the left is a simulation where the leader is this red dot, and it's moving along, basically along the discretized domain, and then it's herding or repelling the robots into the target distribution. And we can do something similar here. This is at the Robotarium, which is a remotely accessible swarm robotics testbed at Georgia Tech. And it's doing something similar. Here we have a virtual leader that's herding the swarm. Okay. So in that case, we just considered robots hopping between states in a discrete domain. But we can also actually solve this problem for robots that evolve according to discrete time nonlinear dynamics, like this discrete time unicycle model. So you can actually design stochastic feedback laws to drive the swarm to some target density over time. And we can also do this on this smooth, compact, connected manifold without boundary, in this case, a torus. So this is another extension of that approach. And in fact, we can achieve arbitrary target densities with disconnected support, so it doesn't have to be positive everywhere in the domain. And we can get the swarm to stop switching between states at equilibrium. So we can also look at a different type of coverage problem, where instead of covering a spatial domain, we're trying to cover boundaries. And here we have a set of objects or regions. We want the swarm to allocate itself among the regions. And there's regions of different types, the blue and yellow circles. So we want the robots to allocate themselves such that at equilibrium, you have, on average, a certain number of robots in the different target regions. So we can also develop a macroscopic model for this scenario, as long as we have a certain number of robots, or a minimum number of robots. We can model this like a chemical reaction network. And in this case, the robots are interacting with segments of the boundaries. So they do have some encounter rates of meeting the boundary or meeting a robot that's bound to the boundary. So now we can take these interactions and model them as products of robots and populations in different states at the macroscopic level. And we can design the control inputs as the probabilities of deciding to bind to the boundary or to detach if there's a robot nearby. And through that, just those two simple rules, we can control the allocation of robots around the boundaries, different types of boundaries over time. Okay, so we were basically trying to come up with ways to redistribute robots over spatial domains or boundaries or among a set of tasks. So now if we consider the environment itself, perhaps this is a sensing task where the robots need to distribute themselves according to some underlying environmental field. Now we can design in this particular case, we're designing the diffusion coefficient of the robots. That is what governs their degree of randomness in their motion. We are making it a function of this environmental field that they're sensing point-wise. So given this, we can prove that the swarm is going to converge to an equilibrium distribution that's proportional to the underlying scalar field. And we can see this in this movie. So this is the swarm density field. These are the collection of simulated robots. The underlying field says ASU. So the swarm basically diffuses to reveal that at equilibrium. And we can also do this on surfaces like the sphere. And in implementation, so this is an experiment. It's actually a series of experiments with a single robot that was done at UCLA with our collaborators. But if you superimpose all the results of the single robot experiments, you can see that the robots tend to cluster around the black circle at equilibrium. Now, in reality, of course, you would want to include collision avoidance. But this particular model doesn't include that. All right, so now if your swarm can actually have an effect on the environment, now we can also include that in our model. And in this particular case, the robots are these little robotic bees, which Giannis actually talked about a version of this earlier today. But this was from a project called RoboBees that was done at Harvard while I was there. So this was motivated by the problem of getting a swarm of robot bees to pollinate a field according to a certain density of pollination, target density. And so we can model these robots as these basically moving according to this stochastic differential equation. They have a velocity, which we can determine, and they have some degree of random motion as well. So given this model, they also have this stochastic decision-making where they can decide to land at a flower that's in their sensing range and hover there. They can also decide to probabilistically leave the flower. And so we can show that there's a general class of target pollination densities that can be reached in finite time using the velocity field of the robots and these reaction parameters, or these rates, as the control inputs. So now we can formulate optimal control problems where we're trying to match the target density as closely as possible within a certain amount of time. And so these two simulations are showing the results for two different target densities of flower visits by the bees. So one of them is this stripe pattern where you have twice as much pollination in alternating rows. And the other one, the bees just have to pollinate the rightmost two rows. And there's some obstacles as well. So you can see that there's some fluctuations around the desired densities. But if you ran a whole bunch of trials and averaged them out, they should show, they should match the target density in the mean field model. So we can also think about other types of pollination type applications. In this case, it's a swarm of nanoparticles basically pollinating a tumor, a line of tumor cells with chemotherapy drugs. But the model is similar in that here it's a reaction diffusion model. There's no advection term, there's no velocity. But the idea here is instead of a control problem, because nanoparticles are hard to control, we are thinking about it from a design perspective in that how do we design the nanoparticle itself with the appropriate chemical properties such that it's internalized not too quickly at the periphery of the tumor, but that it's internalized as it diffuses through the line of cells in such a way that it delivers the minimum amount of chemotherapy drug along the entire line of cells. And so we can pose this also as an optimization problem and figure out, for instance, that we can maybe coat the nanoparticles with something that prevents them from reacting with the tumor cells, and then at some time there's an external trigger like heat or light, and that coating is degraded, and now they can internalize. So we can figure out that time delay parameter until that trigger should be applied using a similar framework as the commercial pollination example. Okay. Now, if your robots can emit something, so if they can alter the concentration of some environmental field, then we can also treat this as an optimization problem. And in this particular case, we can imagine a swarm of underwater vehicles that have onboard actuators that we can model as sources that basically alter or are adding to the environmental field that they're moving in. And so we can design their velocity and the actuator intensity fields in order to achieve different, basically different quantities of the field or the mass of the field over time. So we can regulate it to various values. And yeah, so this is just a sampling of possible problems that can be framed as mean field control problems of swarm densities. And this is just to illustrate that we can use a macroscopic model of the swarm dynamics to design control policies that govern the robot's motion and their decision making in order to achieve some kind of coverage objective, which we can formulate in terms of a controllability or stabilization problem. Okay. So related to movement, we talked about sort of a bulk movement of the swarm, bulk redistribution. But now, if we go down to the individual robots, we do need to make sure that they're not colliding with each other in general. So as they move, we want to make sure that they're avoiding each other and they're avoiding any obstacles in their environment. So now, if we think about a single robot, now we are considering uncertain environments where they might not have access to GPS, as mentioned earlier. So we can think about the problem where we want the robot to navigate at a target velocity. Remember, velocity was one of the possible control inputs for the members of a swarm. And we have a set of unknown obstacles in the environment. So we want the robot to converge to its target velocity while avoiding collisions with the obstacles, which here we're assuming are convex. It's kind of a more complicated problem if they're non-convex. But here we're modeling the robot as just a point mass robot, doesn't have GPS or information about the obstacles, but what it can do is measure its own velocity heading and the minimum distance from any obstacles in its sensing range. So given this, we can come up with a potential field-based controller, which is a very common type of controller used in mobile robotics. And basically, it produces a repulsive type force that prevents the robot from getting too close to an obstacle. So we can come up with this virtual potential function and use the negative gradient of that potential. And in this case, we can devise this as a switching control scheme so that this term is going to apply only when the robot gets within the certain distance of an obstacle. And so you can get these Because of this, you get these switching surfaces that are equidistant from pairs of obstacles, but we can show that there's no equilibrium point that will trap the robot along those surfaces under certain conditions on the potential field parameter. So here's a simulation of a robot moving through an obstacle field with pretty narrow channels between obstacles. And so it does manage to go through. Okay. So in another scenario, let's say that the robot does have GPS. And again, there are unknown obstacles in the environment. Okay, so now again, it's a point mass robot. And we're assuming the same, basically, the additional assumption here is that the robot can measure its own position, in addition to velocity, heading, and minimum distance from obstacles. So we came up with, again, potential-based controllers that are, the potential field is similar to what are called navigation functions developed by Berman and Kodacek. And this allows us to drive the robot to, well, the controller autonomously drives the robot to the goal. And we had some extensions for non-holonomic robots as well, of which this platform is one. So that's for single robots moving through an unknown environment with obstacles. Now, of course, for a swarm, there's going to be other robots, right? So we want to prevent the other robots from crashing into each other. So here's a problem where there are a swarm of robots that all have a target pose that they need to go to, so position and heading. And we want them to go there while avoiding collisions with each other and deadlock situations where they're basically frozen. They can't move past each other to their goal. So here we're assuming that the robots can estimate their pose from odometry. They don't have GPS. In this case, there's no obstacles. And so we can take a nonlinear model predictive control approach, which here it involves centralized computation of the control inputs, which are the velocity control inputs. And so this designs the the velocities of the robots such that they don't get stuck and they converge to their goal. Okay, but maybe there are obstacles that the robots don't know about. Maybe the obstacles are moving. And also there might be other robots. So now with this added complexity, we can still use nonlinear model predictive control, but we can also incorporate what are called barrier functions, which kind of enforce constraints that, for example, can map to areas where the robots cannot go. But the robots won't know where these constraints are in the state space beforehand, so they are actually learning them in real time using a deep neural network, just using their own LiDAR and odometry measurements. And so if the obstacles are not moving too aggressively, they can go through the field of obstacles. And we can do this also with, earlier it showed multiple robots. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk briefly about the mapping problem, or a couple of mapping problems. So as we know, the robots might not know the environment beforehand. Maybe that's not a problem if they can navigate as shown previously, but perhaps their task is to characterize the environment, like a search and rescue, or exploration task. So we've considered problems where the robots are, of course, they have limited sensor measurements within their local range. But if you have a swarm of them, they can map their own local environments, and when they meet each other, they can merge them. And so we came up with a consensus-based approach to this, where the robots have local communication, and they can merge their maps. And we can show that even though they're moving randomly, under certain assumptions on the frequency of their meeting, we can show that their maps all converge to the actual map. Now, we had some later work where we basically removed the assumption that the agent's communication network remains connected over some finite time interval. We don't have that, but we have the restriction here that the agents are moving on a grid. So the robots are moving randomly. They are sensing features in the environment, like this pattern of squares, and they basically have to reconstruct the map of the features. So we can take a consensus-based approach where the robots we can show that they will eventually meet. Maybe it's not the fastest meeting time, but we can show that eventually they will reach consensus and agree on the feature map in the environment. All right, so the last type of task I'm going to talk about is the manipulate part. And specifically, this is about multi-robot manipulation as a group. So in many cases, there might be an object which is too heavy for a single robot to move. And so it might require a team of robots to manipulate to get it to a certain location, for example. And so this problem has been solved by certain species of ants, like the one shown here, which actually they live in Phoenix, in the Phoenix area. So, but it's a common behavior across some other species as well. And basically, the ants are able to move a food item that they find back to their nest. This species will recruit others over both short and long ranges. And they can move this load even over different types of terrain or around obstacles. And they're not communicating with each other. The communication is through the load itself, through the exertions of other ants. And so they're reacting to that. So it's a very interesting example of a decentralized control system. And so we've been inspired by this behavior to develop controllers that are more or less bio-inspired, but the main idea is that we consider cases with similar constraints to the ants, where the robots don't have communication, they don't have prior information about the environment or the payload, and the robot team, and they don't know how many robots are in the team. So in some cases, we just developed an actual model of the biological behavior, in this case, an ant colony. And here, there was video taken by our collaborators of the ants moving basically a fake food item, which was coated in fig juice to smell like food. So basically tricking the ants so that they would try to move this back to their nest. And so from the videos, you can track how many ants are on one side or another of the load. We can measure the rate at which they switch between those sides of the load or just to the detached state. And we can also develop a simple dynamical model of the load itself under these stochastically varying populations of ants in different states. And so we can develop a pretty good model, which we did later use to implement in simulation the stochastic collective transport behavior. So we've also looked at some less literally bio-inspired control strategies for collective transport for instance, to a target velocity. We can use sliding mode controllers and adaptive control in order to develop these basically velocity controllers for collective transport, where the robots only have to know their own velocity and heading, their manipulator angle and heading, and the target speed and direction of the transport. All right. So now just to wrap up with several ongoing challenges that are relevant to the work that I've shown today. Of course, there's many ongoing challenges, but ones that come up throughout the course of this work. So one question is, if we're using mean field models, the differential equation models, to design the controllers, how do we know how close this continuum model is to an actual collective of discrete agents? We see that there's some variation, and the gap closes as the number of robots increase. So we did explore this question a little bit with our collaborators at UCLA, who applied numerical analysis techniques from fluid dynamics to estimate the error between the mean field model and the microscopic model of individual agents. And so this specifically applied to the robot pollination problem, or classes of models that can be used similarly to describe other swarm problems. So the sort of more engineering aspect of this was that we have a method to choose the number of robots and the robot sensing radius to achieve the coverage within a specified error. So that can be a useful approach to be able to set parameters of the system such that you're within a certain error of your predicted behavior. So another question that we can also explore is to incorporate pairwise interactions into the mean field model. So as we saw, they were not included at that macroscopic level, but we would need that in order to not prevent the swarm from showing non-physically high densities, because robots can't overlap with each other. And just to show a couple of examples of what you can do with pairwise interactions. So you can enforce collision avoidance, as we saw. You can also achieve formation control, like this. This strategy is actually based on a PDE model, the wave equation. And another example here is repulsive herding, but in a different way than previously, where the leader is just basically oscillating around a swarm and confining it along a trajectory. So you can get a richer set of behaviors if you could actually include these pairwise interaction terms into the PDE, but that's pretty challenging for analysis and control. And finally, a lot of these strategies are basically assuming that the set of robots are homogeneous in terms of their capabilities and their sets of controllers. But maybe we don't want to limit ourselves to that assumption. Maybe there's heterogeneity in terms of the agent's capabilities, or even just at a basic level, some agents will have more power than others if some have been out longer. So one example of this in nature is another ant experiment on collective transport. Here, the ants are pulling on a little raft made out of straws, and approximately in one direction, just to make it simpler. So from our collaborators' data, it seemed that, so they saw that as more ants are added to this group, the payload moves more slowly. And so it seems that the ant team was moving at the speed of the slowest ant, to basically to accommodate the slowest ant. And so as you add more ants, it gets slower, according to our analysis. So we were able to reproduce this behavior with our robots using a reinforcement learning-based controller. But this is just to show that, at least in nature, maybe this is a way just to keep the system moving, keep making progress, even though some ants are stronger than others. So maybe this is a way for us to extract the most value out of all of our robots, even though some of them may be losing power or not as capable as others. In any case, so that was a summary of my lab's work on control strategies for robot swarms. We also work in some other areas which I didn't discuss today, but I think you can certainly look at our webpage, our publication list. And at this point, I will end, and thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for the speaker?
Hi, great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I have a question about this multi-agent feature reconstruction. You mentioned that you discretize the environment and you allow the network to be even disconnected, right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is there any dependence on the resolution of the discretized network while allowing disconnectivity? And is there any upper bound on time of disconnectivity of the network to guarantee that you will achieve this feature reconstruction?
So in that work with the discretized domain, there was a guarantee that the system would eventually reach consensus on the features and reconstruct the domain. As you increase the size of the domain, so the size of the domain and number of robots, both are going to affect how long it takes to reach consensus. We don't really have theoretical bounds. That was one thing that my student was looking into, but yeah, but numerically, we saw that both of those are factors.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for a couple of more questions. And Jeffrey Herman, I think you're the next talk. So if you want to come and start getting your computer set up, we can ask a couple of more questions. So one of my questions was, you had a model, I am remembering in my head the simulation where it was like a gridded environment, but it was the same slide where you had also the experiments at Georgia Tech. And there was a herder and a bunch of, like, I guess, herdy robots. I was kind of curious the dynamics there, because it looked like there was also some random distribution happening among the herdy robots.
Yeah, okay, so so they were moving basically in a discretized environment, and if the leader was over their square, then they would move to an adjacent square, but with a uniform probability to go to any adjacent square. So that was the stochastic part of the motion.
Got it, okay, thank you very much. And if anybody else has a question, if you don't, I have another question, but I want to give other people a chance to. So I was curious for the ant work at the end. I was captivated by the ants and I lost track of the counter, sorry about my alarm going off. But the fact that, like, they kind of slow down to the speed of the weakest ant, if the rest of the ants could easily kind of carry the thing on their own, is there any kind of sensing of you know, like, oh, you know, the weakest ant doesn't have to put in kind of any force or something, and they can move like faster?
So if the others can move it on their own, you're saying, why is the ant freeloading, or?
Well, I guess like if the weakest ant is not required to move the thing, then do they speed up, or do they also still slow down to the weakest ant speed?
I think it's, so we just had the data of like the speed of the load under different numbers of ants. And I think that, I don't know if we had the data to see like whether or not this specific group of ants, like that they're capable of moving it, but then we had another ant. And yeah, it was just basically a statistical analysis of the speeds, but.
Okay, got it.
Yeah,
It's easy to like anthropomorphize the ants, and I guess like,
yeah,
to anthropomorphize them, I'm like, okay, well, maybe they just don't know that the weakest one isn't helping, and they're like, no, come on, you can help us out too, and they're like, you know, waiting for it to like do the thing. But
yeah, we just have hypotheses that seem reasonable to the biologists, and
okay,
that's about all.
fair. Yeah, domain experts. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's really awesome talk. You have so much work. It's amazing. It's just like too many things for me to wrap my head around right now. But thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it too. Let's give the speaker one more hand.
Thank you.